the other faith of modernism, also called Christian liberalism, or J. Gresham Machen just called liberalism. We saw how that came to not just infiltrate the mainline denominations of Protestant churches in our country, but it really came to own, like a cancer comes in and metastasizes through a body. So the anti-biblical, anti-Christian religion called modernism or liberalism, it was a cancer into the mainline denominations. And Machen fought that battle as well as others, but the conclusion, you may remember, is they actually had to leave. Machen was defrocked, thus the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church, was founded. Also from that line come the PCA later on. Westminster Theological Seminary is also a product of that particular breach in the Presbyterian Church. There were others as well, but in that sense, we concluded with that period of church history and looked especially at the significance of Machen. We then traveled through the events and the dynamics at play with World War I and World War II. And so what I want us to do is continue what's happening, set it in context, but we're going to get into some of the battles within the church and an emergence of new ministries, new methods of ministry, and we're going to center our view, our window into this period on two men, Billy Graham and Martin Lloyd-Jones. So, Christianity in the mainline denominations in the United States of America suffered catastrophically through the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. And I think Machen's assessment was correct, that Christianity and liberalism are two different faiths and they cannot mix. What emerged after that battle and ultimately, for the most part, the split was Ecumenicalism. We could call it ecumenical faith. This followed the mainline denominations, which were for the most part ruled and reigned by modernism, or at least modernistic or liberalistic tendencies, that they now wanted all of the churches, the different denominations, they wanted them to work together. And this kind of view of the church is called ecumenicalism or ecumenism. Seminaries, denominations, individual churches, organizations arose with this ecumenical spirit. It did not want, nor could it, define terms, even most basic terms such as what is a Christian. And so it was fundamentally and intrinsically opposed to distinctions and definitions. If someone, whether that's a church leader, a Christian, a church, a denomination, if they profess to be Christian, there wasn't any kind of consideration for what that actually meant when they said that. The real moral ground that ecumenical faith stood on and called for was unity. Unity. So morally, the kind of leverage point that ecumenical faith said is that since the church is not unified, the church is ineffective. You may have heard before that theology divides. That is, in one sense, a kind of a stepchild from ecumenical faith, that if you're going to have doctrines that require definitions and distinctions, you're fundamentally going to create distinctions that will not enable unity, and that is really what we need to have, this unity, even at the cost of doctrinal fidelity. So that's ecumenism began to really connect these churches that suffered, in my opinion, apostasy from the heresy of liberalism. This is the backdrop for what we're going to talk about tonight for the church in America, and we'll also see the church in Britain. It's during the post-World War II period. So ecumenical faith is in that sense the way that the mainline Protestant denominations drifted. And post-World War II is the period that we're going to set as the setting. And here we're going to see that evangelicals did not accept ecumenical faith. They knew that you had to at least distinguish what a Christian was. That at least was retained by evangelicals of all stripes in this particular period. But what was not agreed upon by evangelicals, both in America and in Britain, is how do evangelicals relate to denominations that were, at least in part, ecumenical in their participation with other churches, denominations, organizations? How does churches which are evangelical, or individuals, especially church leaders who are evangelicals, how do they interact with these denominations, organizations, or individuals that have mixed identities, not distinguishing whether someone is a Christian or whether someone is a liberal or a modern unbelieving person? So this is the setting of what we're going to talk about. Ian Murray explains this setting for us. I quote him: "If agreeing to the ground rule, 'we are all Christians,' end quote, was necessary to gain ecumenical and denominational acceptance, how could such agreement be consistent with the uniqueness of their beliefs? If evangelical belief is, in essence, how Christian fellowship exists independently of any common commitment to that belief." And so do you see the necessary tension that evangelicals are now going to have to navigate? Evangelicalism, even at its most basic common denominator, believes a Christian is born again. A Christian believes that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the Savior for sinners. He is the sin-atoning sacrifice that ransomed God's people. They do believe the gospel message and its component parts. All right, evangelicalism has these definitions, these distinctions. Therefore, with these, committed, unique beliefs, how can they have agreement with those who will only say we are all Christians and not distinguish beliefs? Right? Do you see the tension that is set up there? Right. So this is the struggle that we're going to look at after World War II. So I've said a few words. I'm going to ask you to do this. Would you just raise your hand and say, could you please define that term that you use? There's going to be a number of terms, whether it's ecumenicalism or denominationalism, or there could be isms that we're going to talk about that you could say, what does that mean? All right, so please do that. Please interrupt. Please raise your hand so I can define those. After World War II, the evangelical church continued to struggle, and I want to quote from James 3, with how they navigate those who are committed to what Jude says: "Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, exhorting you that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints." Jude goes on to describe what was taking place. "For certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who were long beforehand marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turned the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ." And so the struggle to earnestly contend for the faith which was, and this is an important distinction, once for all handed down to the saints. is going to be one of the features that we get to learn about how the church did this in this particular period of history. Which raises for you and for me, do you believe that the Christian faith was once for all delivered to the saints? Or do you believe that the Christian faith is developing? Do you believe that the church is developing its doctrines? Or do you believe, as I think the Bible clearly here states, that no, the Christian faith was delivered once for all to the church? We're not going to go there, but you could read, especially Paul, First Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 15. He talks about that he received what was delivered to him. In that sense, you could understand that the Christian faith, its doctrines, its distinctions, its definitions, its belief, its content is like a package that the apostles have given to the next generation. And that generation has the job to take that same package, uncorrupted, and give it to the next generation, and so on and so forth. Do you believe that that is the way the Christian faith is? Or do you believe it's changing, adapting, developing, adding? Because if you believe that, that now means you are going to be in tension. There's going to be some kind of difficulty of how are you going to navigate with those who say that they are Christians and yet do not believe that the Christian faith today in its content, distinctives, and doctrines is the same as it was the generation before, and the generation before, and the generation before, all the way to that which the apostles were given. So that's a helpful struggle, contention that we need to embrace, and we need to learn how has this contention been handled in the past. And this particular period in history, I think, is very helpful for us to learn about it, both from negative examples and from positive examples. I'll let you go ahead and anticipate. Who is going to be the positive example? Who is going to be the negative example? Billy Graham or Martin Lloyd-Jones? We're also going to see that the church in this particular period after World War II had to face the struggle to biblically distinguish the nature of the church. So we're a Baptist or Baptistic church. We don't belong to a Baptist denomination, which interestingly enough, does any Baptist church belong to a denomination? Well, the way in which people talk about it, you would say yes. But if you think about what Baptists believe, such as the way Congregationalists, which Martin Lloyd-Jones was, the way they believe the nature of the church, that the church itself is made up of local congregations that are autonomous and self-governing. Denominations, in one sense, normally, or at least more consistently, apply to those like Presbyterians or Episcopalians, whose view of the church is, you can see this in the definition, the PCA is the abbreviation for the Presbyterian Church of America. That is to say, the church, the Presbyterian Church, is not restricted to or limited to one congregation, such as Harvest Presbyterian in Jacksonville or Village Presbyterian on Matamore's Lane. That is just one place that the Presbyterian Church of America has a location. Do you understand that distinction? So this struggle of the biblical nature of the church is something that is a part of some of the challenges that this particular period of history produced. How does the church understand itself, and therefore how does it relate to others? That will be one of the issues that we get to sort of, hover over this period of church history and see how are they trying to work this through, because this will be a point of contention. Another observation that we can make from the struggle of the church after World War II is how does the church biblically distinguish itself from its cultural setting while remaining in it and faithfully worshiping and serving Jesus as king there, right? So how does the church biblically distinguish itself from America? How does the church distinguish itself biblically from the British culture and society? And so this is a perennial challenge that churches face. Like right now, the church in Russia needs to be able to biblically distinguish itself from Russia while being in Russia, worshiping Jesus there in Russia right now, serving Jesus there in Russia right now. How does the church do that? We'll see that this is one of the things that the church is going to have to figure out. And I think we'll have, better and worse examples of how they were seeking to do that. Any questions thus far? This is sort of to set the context for what we're going to look at.
In your comment about Southern Baptists,
yes,
they see themselves, I guess, as unlike Presbyterians, they participate in what they call the cooperative program. They send their money from tithes to a central place, and that central place distributes money back to retired pastors and to different things in missions. Then once a year they used to, I don't know if they still do, take up what they call a Lottie Moon offering for missionaries. And they have a magazine they send out that's free. You can pick up a little book, I forget the name of it. Used to get it when I was a kid and read through it. But they feel united through those efforts. Like there's a united people. But I agree with you. The Baptist church I went to, Southern Baptist Church, it was no one's authority. As a matter of fact, and when I was in the 10th grade, when the racial stuff was going on, our church voted whether or not to have, and I won't extend this too long, there was a state center for the blind within walking distance, where they trained blind people to use canes and that sort of thing. And some of the black people who in the blind center wanted to walk to our church and attend services. We're all white church. And so we actually had a vote, our first vote, sophomore in high school. And I voted for black people to come to our church. But the church voted it down. And there was no recommendation from the Southern Baptist Convention of anything. Because it didn't affect everybody the way it affected us. And so the church independently voted to be racist. Which point I think I slowly and surely left the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah, I think so. Is there anybody on Zoom? So Jerry's bringing up from his experience the way a Southern Baptist church is a part of the cooperative program, but each individual church makes decisions. Jerry, I think that's a good organization, like in the sense of how Baptist churches are going to cooperate. Whether you go to Britain, it would be called the Baptist Union. They call it the same thing in South Africa, the Baptist Union. They call it the same thing, I think, when I was in Russia, the Baptist Union. And what do we call our country? A union. So I think that that's actually an accurate way to talk about what are Baptist churches who believe in the autonomy of the local church, that they are independent, self-governed, such that they do make votes, and that's the decision of that church, and the votes of the closest Baptist church, they may vote in the opposite way. I think that is a consistent way that Baptist churches organize. But you can see in one sense, they struggled to figure out how or if and how we would cooperate in union is one word that we use, such as the same way we talk about the Union of 50 states, to talk about what is the nature of our state's relationship to our nation. But at least you're able to see, like, that is the struggle and that is the solution that Baptist churches have. And I would suggest, Jerry, that that's what every Baptist church does. If they cooperate with another Baptist church, it's going to be some iteration of the same principles.
My point was that that's really not the Southern Baptist Convention, and there's really not an authority there.
That's right.
Over the local churches. Each church is sort of doing its own thing, and the corporation seems to be for the benefit of missionaries and pastors' retirement, and I think they run some retirement homes and things like that.
Yeah, so in that sense, what you see is, and this will come up, we'll see in one sense, this element, it's a parachurch organization that is serving the church. So that's one illustration of the category we're going to be looking at, and that is, how do individual churches relate to other churches as well as other organizations, Christian organizations, and then how do individual leaders, whether they're pastors like Martin Lloyd-Jones was, or whether they're just evangelists like Billy Graham was, how do they relate to other Christian leaders, especially when you're having to deal with what we talked about, liberalism, modernism, and this ecumenical statement for unity, even at the expense of gospel distinctions.
I left one out. They also offer a single.
Yeah, Tim's going to one. So we're gonna. That's just one illustration of this continued struggle. Which just the reality is you have to do this. You can't sort of opt out. You're going to, even if you say we're going to be independent and work with no one, that's still a decision. So this is going to be a struggle that the church is always going to have. And I think this particular period, and especially looking at Lloyd-Jones and Billy Graham, is going to help us see some of the things that we do have to navigate in the way that we interact with, partner with other Christians and churches. Well, post-war America, as you know, Ken, I believe you are a baby boomer. Jerry, you and Donnie are baby boomers. All right. So America after World War II boomed in babies and income. Baby boomers were the children born to the generation that fought World War II. It is the largest generation in American history. I think that is still the case. The Depression, which preceded the war effort, and then the war itself, kept Americans more austere and fiscally conservative. But after the war, the American economy produced an unprecedented amount of goods. That generation of America became the most affluent generation in the history of the world to that point. We have added to that affluence today. Women who had worked during the war to do the jobs necessary that men at war could not do, all those women did not return home when the men came home. And this is a significant shift in the history of America, that now the traditional roles of the wife being devoted unto the husband and to the children shifted such that it was accepted in a unique way for women to work outside the home, and husbands seem to gladly accept the benefits of dual incomes at this expense. The American dream was articulated at this particular point in history, and it was accomplished for many, especially those who were able to move to this new development outside of cities called suburbs. So if you wonder, when did the suburb emerge in America? It was with the baby boomers. It is at this time that those in the inner city left. This is mainly the whites in the inner city. They left for the suburbs, and what do you think went with them? This is a church history class? The church. The churches went with them. All right. So when those whites left the inner cities, the churches left too. The consequence. This is where you always have to think in terms. There's always the interrelationship of economics, politics, with church history. What is the consequence when you have what some have called white flight from the cities into the suburbs, and now you have this sort of new iteration of the Protestant church in the suburbs? What is the consequence for the cities? Ken and Jerry, y'all live. Donna, you lived through it.
Economically, it was tax base was not there any longer, and the church were left with minorities in the cities, as they still exist today, primarily minorities, and so the influence of the church, at least the white church, was gone.
That's exactly right. So when you have the exodus of those who were making money and generating businesses that had a high tax benefit to the cities, that is now removed, and the cities suffered in financial, educational, and in cultural ways. This then made the city less economically prosperous, and thus a more difficult place to live. Largely populated by those who were poor, is now more affordable to live in the city, but it also was marked by racial minorities. You had the vacuum of the denominations that had churches in those city centers now, and so you have new churches, denominations, iterations of Protestant Christianity as well as cults enter into the cities. So the cities become very different, almost in every way, with the suburbs. In addition, the differences between the rural areas of America and those who were living in the suburbs and in the cities were also significantly different. If you remember the Protestant denominations that had been wrecked through the cancer of modernism, those denominations, they had members, constituents for the whole history of our country in rural locations. But now with this change from one modernism coming into the significant churches and the mainline Protestant denominations in the cities, now those churches have gone to the suburbs. That sort of left this modernism in these churches that were either going to be in the suburbs or struggle in the cities. Rural members of those churches, the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, USA, Episcopalian churches, the rural members of those churches were substantially different than the leaders of the denominations, and the denominational headquarters, the denominational leaders, they didn't live anywhere close to their rural constituents. And so this widened the difference between those who were traditionally a part of one of the mainline Protestant denominations and those who are in the sort of new version of these denominations. This created a vacuum, or maybe we should say a demand, for those in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas for new denominations, churches, movements, organizations to sort of seize on what now has left the cities and the rural churches. Holiness churches are one of those groups. Do you know what holiness churches is? What I refer to when I say the holiness church. So Pentecostal holiness would be one version of holiness churches. Does anybody know of another kind of holiness church? You can even find, like I've seen them in Eastern North Carolina, you could have like Baptist, Pentecostal holiness, like this sort of amalgam of distinctions, and I'm going like, how does that all come together? All right, but what you find, especially in rural places and in urban places is holiness churches of various kinds come in, and they begin to fill the place of especially Methodist and Baptist churches that preceded them. Pentecostal churches, which are normally holiness churches, they also grow in large numbers in the same constituents, rural and urban. And there, one of the emphases that the holiness churches of the various iterations, they really accent an experience and an immediate sort of leap in your status of sanctification that doesn't require the intellect and the will. So, by way of a spiritual experience of sorts, you're able to sort of move up, if you will, in the levels of sanctification without having to necessarily learn something, choose something, change a habit, and that gains traction in these two different demographic places in our country. Additionally to this, though really with more numbers later on, is the charismatic movement. It has its second wave in the 1950s that really explodes in the 60s and the 70s. The first wave of charismatic activity came in the West Coast, started in Azusa, the Azusa Street Revival in California. I lived in Van Nuys for 1 year, and I was told that it was in, I think it's St. Mark's Episcopal Church, which is in Van Nuys, California, that also was one of the places that the first wave of the charismatic movement started. I don't know if it might have been the second wave, but it illustrates that the charismatic movement in this second wave was a trans-denominational movement. So if you think of charismatic as only coming to sort of the Assemblies of God churches or maybe non-denominational charismatic churches, that's not how it started. There was actually the first church, one of the first churches was an Episcopalian church. There was also Roman Catholics that were a part of this second wave of the charismatic movement. The charismatic movement is the view that the particular gifts of tongues, prophecy, healings, these revelatory and sign gifts that we see associated with the apostles and Jesus in the Gospels and the book of Acts, that these gifts actually are present in the church today, and they should be expected and prayed for and used. And this charismatic second wave really takes traction in the 1950s. So new theologies are emerging with this change in Protestant Christianity, and really like the shifts that are taking place in really the demographics of America at this point. In addition to holiness and Pentecostal theologies, charismatic theologies, there's all some other versions of theologies. Psychological Christianity emerged during this period, and it, I think, has proven to be the most lasting influence, and maybe not as much as modernism has been, but I would say second only to modernism is the influence of secular psychology in Protestant Christianity in our country. It was especially attractive. This is in contrast to holiness and charismatic Christianity. Psychological Christianity was especially attractive to the affluent individual Christians and congregations in the suburbs who had been historically associated with mainline Protestants. What psychological Christianity did is it made the Christian faith a means to personal peace, satisfaction, and happiness. You may have heard of Norman Vincent Peale. He would be one of the forefathers of or fathers of psychological Christianity. I think later on, has anybody heard of Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral? He would be another iteration of, in my opinion, of psychological Christianity. Black liberation theology also emerges during this post-war period in the Protestant church in America. It comes in its academic dress from James Cone, who was a professor at Union Theological Seminary. It was taken up from not just the academic arguments that James Cone gave, but it was taken up in the Black urban community by the churches that were there, and then it was preached by the pastors in a number of those pulpits. It is reemerged today in quarters of the evangelical Protestant church with these not the Black Lives Matter movement, but with some evangelicals that have really called for us to consider systemic racism. And James Cone and his theology has been favorably accepted, unfortunately, by some Protestant Christian theologians and pastors today. We add to this second wave feminism. You remember first wave feminism? What were the two constitutional amendments that first wave feminism had a significant part in? Women's suffrage, 19th Amendment, and 18th Amendment, prohibition. All right, so if you want to understand who was really causing a big fuss about alcohol consumption, it was a number of first wave feminists, many of which came from the church in America at the time. Second wave feminism comes in post-World War II America, and it really comes to gain a great deal of traction and influence in the Protestant churches, such that by the time you come to the beginning, like the 1950s, it would have been exceptional to imagine a woman to be ordained as a pastor. When you come to the 1980s, you find that it is the dominant practice, the position of mainline denominational churches to ordain women to ministry. And so the second wave of feminism came at this time, and women become ordained as pastors or ministers in mainline Protestant denominations by the 1980s. Just in case you're wondering, so I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, not too far from here, about 2 hours from here, and it was not very far from Wake Forest, which has Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I grew up in the 80s. And I can remember what was being said about the fight within Southern Baptists, and the idea did center around, again, what is the Bible? Is it the Word of God, as Tim is teaching us on Sunday mornings? But also, what can a man do and what can a woman do? And I grew up in a church that was affected by liberalism or modernism. And so I'm not raised by evangelicals. I think that's, if you ever wonder, like, why am I weird? That's one reason. Like, I have no sensitivity to evangelical Christianity because it didn't grow up in evangelical Christianity. I have no sensitivity to fundamentalism because I didn't grow up in fundamentalism. I grew up in a Protestant liberal church, just not knowing that that's what it was. But even in eastern North Carolina, in a small town without a stoplight, the influence of second wave feminism and modernism came to influence local churches. Right? So it's that significant what's going on at this time. Now, I think we all would say that we have heard of Billy Graham. Right? Does everyone raise your hand if you know who Billy Graham is? All right, Julianne, you don't know who Billy Graham is? You're just being a rebel and you don't want to raise your hand? All right. Elizabeth, you'll learn who Billy Graham is.
You want us to come forward if we know it?
All right. I do think, I mean, who has a totally negative view of Billy Graham would be completely off base. So what we're going to go through is not because I have this absolute category that Billy Graham is a villain. So that is not my judgment. But I do think that we learn some things that emerge from Billy Graham and the Billy Graham Evangelical Association that was created in 1950. You may know that Billy Graham is from North Carolina. He's from the mountains of North Carolina. Charlotte seems, for whatever reason, to claim him. Black Mountain. No, Montreat. Is it Montreat or Black Mountain that he lived? Montreat. Um, he in that sense, he doesn't come from sort of elite, upper class, white collar, urban America. He comes from more rural North Carolina, and he emerges and connects with the tradition of American revivalism. He becomes ordained by Southern Baptist. I heard he actually went to Wheaton. I think one Presbyterian said if he'd done better at Greek, he probably would have become a Presbyterian. But this is where Billy Graham emerges from, and what is significant about Billy Graham, and why I do think that he is a very significant feature that we can learn a lot about what the church was having to struggle with and figure out, and people were coming to very different conclusions, is how does the church and Christians think about the church and the ministry of the gospel in this new world that has emerged. Billy Graham's Evangelical Association took donations from a very broad group of people, and that association became very, very rich with capital resources. They employed the most advanced communication tools and techniques of the period. And while Billy Graham himself was conservative socially, at least in the minimalistic theology that he communicated, he remained conservative, especially at this particular, the initial point in his ministry. He, however, worked with a broad group of Christians, including theologically liberal to apostate church leaders and church denominations. The Billy Graham Evangelical Association was committed to have no conflicts over Christian distinctives. Ian Murray has written a book that for me was very significant called Evangelicalism Divided, which chronicles Billy Graham's ministry, theology, philosophy, and practice, with contrast to Martin Lloyd-Jones' ministry, theology, philosophy, and practice in London and at the Westminster Chapel. Both of these two men and their ministries, and sort of seeing them in contrast to one another, provides case studies for us that I think help us. And I believe it's actually very applicable to what we need to figure out in the church today. While Billy Graham kept his theology and his view of Scripture intact as it relates to orthodoxy and what an evangelical would be committed to, he diluted it enough to be accepted almost in every part of influential society of the United States and abroad at the time. You probably know that most presidents in the course of Billy Graham's life, after he became a prominent evangelist, invited Billy Graham to the White House to give him pastoral counsel. You may know that Billy Graham even was given conversation with the Queen of England. Lloyd-Jones, in contrast, articulated a doctrinal basis of evangelical unity, and he did not even accept Billy Graham's invitation to sit on the platform with him during his London crusade because of Billy Graham's formal, visible associations with apostate church leaders, people who have denied fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. Billy Graham and Martin Lloyd-Jones, while they are different men from Martin Lloyd-Jones, first you need to understand, like, he was not English. I wish Daniel were here so I could drive home this point. He was Welsh, all right? So he was, he came from Wales. He actually had the opportunity to live in a small town, but he became a prominent doctor. They saw him to have sort of a future of very significant and successful medical practice, and he turns from that and goes into the ministry. And that way we could say, even before Martin Lloyd-Jones went into the ministry, he proved himself to be a very intelligent man, very successful man, just with his potential medical career. And then he transitions into ministry. Billy Graham, as we've said, is from small town North Carolina. He does go to Wheaton, a prestigious evangelical Christian university, but he doesn't excel in the academic side of seminary. But Billy Graham and Lloyd-Jones, different in context, different backgrounds, different giftedness. They enable us to take a look at the challenges for the church during this post-World War II and we're going to go up to the 1980s. In America, evangelicals were on an offensive strategic campaign of sorts led by a host of ministries and organizations that led to national prominence of their identity and place in American society, especially politics. So maybe Ken, Jerry, and Donnie, you can remember illustrations of this sort of strategic campaign that came from a number of different quarters would have included the moral majority. You remember that? All right. And we'll talk about some others, but Donnie, I see you have your hand raised. I do not. Tim, did he even get seminary training? To be honest, I don't know if he did.
I remember he wore a suit on the beach, but I don't remember.
So no, Donnie, I do not know. And if I'm going to have to, I don't think he did. I don't think he went to seminary. So categorically, we also need to understand this. So prior to this period, post-World War II, is evangelical Christian a category that people think in America? This is a yes or no question. No. You would have thought in terms of, are you a Baptist? Are you a Presbyterian? Are you a Methodist? They would have thought in terms of the different Protestant denominations. They do not think in terms of evangelical. So ultimately, I do have some things when we finish up this whole thing, I'm going to make a case for how, in my mind, we kind of take the best that we can from church history and think about ourselves. This has been sort of a lifelong Christian project for me, so I'll at least give you the iteration that I have at present. All right, so evangelical now is like a new category. It's a new designation. We've talked about it historically, it was a moniker used to talk about a Lutheran or a Reformed Christian during the Protestant Reformation. It was used as a moniker, like a term of derision towards the Puritans. It technically means it's just the gospel. The good news is euangelion. And so now it is talking about someone who is committed to the good news, a Bible person. That's its origin. At this point, you need to understand that is not what evangelical means. Evangelical is emerged now to be in contrast to an ecumenical Christian. It also is like another layer of distinction, maybe another hyphen, as opposed to, okay, are you a Protestant? What kind of Protestant? And then you would hyphenate it, I'm an evangelical Protestant. So you even see me, when I'll say the Evangelical Protestant Church in America, I'm making a designation that you didn't need to make that designation 150 years ago. Right? So this is what evangelicalism now means. And so through this period of time after World War II, evangelicals from a lot of different quarters, they are on a campaign to make evangelical Christianity to have a prominent, significant place within American society. Evangelical is now going to be contrasted with fundamentalist. Because what emerged, as you may remember, is when Machen was fighting, he was fighting over the fundamentals. And he had, in one sense, a confederation of forces that were fighting with him, who were quite different from him on a number of points. And so, but what emerged from that group are a number of different churches, denominations, seminaries, and one of those is what developed as fundamentalism. Evangelicalism, after World War II, with the rise, particularly, you can trace it with Billy Graham, and we'll look at other institutions. It's trying to sort of fashion it, form it in the eyes of American society as different from fundamentalism. This is achieved, in my opinion, in the same way that liberalism in the early 20th century achieved its influence. So how is that? How did liberalism in the early 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, how did it come into the church and achieve its traction, gain traction? Okay, so indeed, seminaries were the greenhouse of doing it, but what's the particular strategy, scheme, method? Okay, but how did they attack it? Did they go ahead and say, like, let us debate inerrancy? In those particular individuals, schools, sort of views that Tim just talked about improper, those would have been the established views accepted in Europe. And so Protestants, mainline Protestants, and especially in the seminaries, they wanted to be accepted by, in one sense, the establishment, the theological establishment, which was centered in Europe. The strategy that I think that evangelicals, which is going to be called Neo-Evangelicalism, arising from the 50s and forward, they take the same approach. We want to be accepted with establishment culture. The people who have perceived influence, the movers and shakers, generally you'd say high culture. They want to be received, accepted, seen as something that should be considered, listened to, esteemed. In the same way, that's how liberalism gained traction within the mainline Protestant churches. They wanted to have acceptance with the theological academic guild. So you can see, in one sense, why fundamentalism kind of, and this is very broad brushes, it sort of is easy to paint it as a backwoods, anti-intellectual sort of denigration of Christianity, because it was seen to retreat. It was seen to go into its sort of own little, ghetto where they don't have to fight and advocate and interact. And so neo-evangelicalism really wanted to make sure that it changed, but in order to do that, my estimation of it, and you can look at others, I would suggest to you George Marsden's book, Reforming Fundamentalism, which is all about neo-evangelicalism, is that they wanted to appeal to secular society's sensitivities, to the dominant high culture of America. And so how do you do that? Well, you need to start a seminary that's going to be seen as academically rigorous by the establishment, regime. That's probably two militaristic words, all right? But two seminaries that emerged to accomplish this are in Massachusetts, Gordon Conwell, and Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. Right? They were indeed academically rigorous. They wanted to achieve that while retaining an absolute commitment to Protestant orthodoxy. So that was, in one sense, their kind of goal. But in addition to the institutions that would sort of show we are academically equal to whatever the other institutions are putting out, you should academically esteem us, accept us, listen to us. They also had another way that they were appealing to the dominant secular society's sensitivities, and that is they wanted a certain kind of church and pastor that they wanted to produce. And so one of the leaders who was also a prototype of this would be Harold Akinga. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Tim, do you know this man? All right, so he pastored a prominent church in Boston, Massachusetts. He was a very smart man. He was an articulate preacher. And so, in that sense, you see the model here, and the design of neo-evangelicalism is through the seminaries, through this model kind of pastor that would be produced, through churches that would emerge from this seminary, these kind of men. It would be persuasive and effective to what used to be Protestant mainline Americans, which had dominated the American culture for our nation's history. Billy Graham and his form of evangelism was, in one sense, another way that this sort of campaign, if you will, for neo-evangelicalism was going to influence America for Christ. Now, I have zero reason to doubt the absolute intentions of all of these individuals. And you can read a number of these individuals, and it's fantastic what they have written. But when we look at Billy Graham's approaches, I think we can see that they were willing to pay a price of doctrinal fidelity that promised its future demise. When Billy Graham was seeking to have these crusades in prominent American cities, he would go into those cities and he would invite the most prominent individuals in that particular city from any church background, no matter their commitment to Orthodox Christianity. So he would have apostates sitting with him on stage in his crusades if it seemed as if that would create a draw for a broader, greater appeal to, the American society that he was preaching to. This was in this way, this is a strategic shift, pivot, change from the way in which fundamentalism was perceived. So if you don't know about fundamentalism, we probably need to talk a little bit about fundamentalism, right? Fundamentalism, by this point, had developed its own sense of an identity. It had its own institutions as well, its own sort of features and commitments. So I can at least say 3 of you, 5 of you have some influence of fundamental Christianity in your Christian background and tradition. So you can add to it, correct me if I'm inaccurate on this description. But what fundamentalism had done by this particular point is that it had broken away. It had clearly said, no, we are not going to participate with apostates. We're not going to be able to partner with those who forsake the fundamentals of the Christian faith. But they had also added to clear, essential, doctrinal distinctions that separate Christians from apostates, from the church, from false religion, some secondary, I'll say, some secondary applications that became too prominent in the identity of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism's churches and seminaries did not have a force in mainstream America. If you went to an Ivy League school and you say, I graduated from Bob Jones, that would not really mean much to them, all right? It was perceived in mainstream America that neo-evangelicalism is going at, especially high culture America. It would have been perceived as a backwoods, degenerated Christianity. And so fundamentalism, in that sense, it was cut off. I would say not only did it cut itself off, it was also cut off from avenues of influence. And so it developed into its sort of own subculture. Its members, churches, organizations, seminaries had certain features that also had to do with navigating a very dynamic, changing world. So at this time, from the 1950s to up to the 1980s, we've talked about the Cold War has begun. But with that Cold War, especially in the 50s, there was a scare of communism, having communists in America, right? So what does that create, especially after you just fought World War II? Fear. People are scared. Right? In addition to that, the civil rights movement is going on in the South, as well as other places. Right? So there is real upheaval. You then add to that there is real apostasy. You have seen people reject the Christian faith. And so in that sense, when these things take place, what do you imagine people are going to want to do? You're going to want to sort of defend and stake off what was. And I'm sure you believe that what was is better than what seems to be coming. And so I think for various reasons, fundamentalism did this, and I think they made some significant mistakes in doing so, because with the same fierceness that was applied to the fundamentals of the Christian faith, it is applied to, at best, secondary doctrines and applications, and at worst, non-biblical positions, such that fundamentalism becomes associated with KJV only, Bible translation use, the temperance commitment, racial segregation, dispensationalism, and other distinctives that were unique to their subculture as opposed to biblical tests of fidelity. So you can clarify, there's 5 people who have drank from some kind of faucet within fundamentalism, so you can make some distinctions. Would that be accurate, Tim, would you say?
I would say that the fundamentalists also started their own school, and they had to make some rules for the students, how to dress, talk, listen to on the radio, all kinds of rules for the students. And
What music they listen to.
those rules became infused into the church. They sort of did separate at that point when they made the rules for the schools. It became kind of the rules for the ladies of the church and the men of the church in regards to dress and music and movies and all that sort of stuff. And so that's kind of the way I see some of that became part of the fundamentalist culture.
Yeah, you especially can imagine that when people are fearful, that really takes traction. If you're fearful for what are your children and grandchildren going to do? And if you have some kind of, especially if you wed that with certain things like such as Arminian theology, you can see like that is persuasive in the mind of a church member. You mean if I can, like I want to keep those kinds of things from influencing my son or daughter or my husband or my wife or what. So I don't think we're throwing stones as if it is somehow impossible or strange for us. I do want us to remember Machen's example. I think that he is the example that we should follow, and I do not think that fundamentalism is the example that we should follow. I think there's significant reasons that they made those mistakes. I think there's significant reasons that Machen didn't, and we should understand those doctrinal reasons for it. And that's why I gave you the illustration of why he, protested the Presbyterian Church's approval of the 18th Amendment. And I think that failure for those who became a part of fundamentalism, that failure has in one sense produced, I don't want to call it like a mortal blow, but I think it has had significant consequences. Because I am a fundamentalist, but the Bible is what gives the authority for the fundamentals. So anything that weakens that commitment to fundamentals is that's a significant loss. And I think actually what fundamentalism has done is they've not strengthened, they've weakened their commitment to the fundamentals because of this lack of being able to distinguish. We do it this way because, and they give some kind of explanation that separates it from the Bible says. So now this is an issue of Christian liberty as opposed to an issue of, fidelity, such that, so when we're talking about neo-evangelicalism, when we're thinking about Billy Graham, you're needing to think about him as sort of positioned on one hand between fundamentalism and ecumenicalism. And they're having this goal of making evangelical Christianity to really be attractive, influential in high society American culture, and really wanting to make sure they're not seen as fundamentalists. But the cost for them to do that is they actually compromise on doctrine. They compromise on the truth, not in the sense of that they are denying Orthodox Christian doctrine, but in their ministry, practice, and philosophy. Namely, who do they unite with? They compromise. What is the gospel and what is biblical truth? That wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was intentional. It was a strategy. It was a part of the campaign. And in this way, when we come to the sort of trying to summarize, these post-war years were paradoxical, because what actually took place is the campaign, on one sense, seemed to work. Evangelicals were understood. By the time Ronald Reagan in the 80s comes to be elected, evangelicals are seen as a powerful, significant voting constituency. So in one sense, you could say it worked. But I would say it's more like like if you ever, I don't know much about cars, but like, if you buy a car company's car that's really like, they just make a sorry car, but brand new off the lot, it's like shiny and new, and it's got power windows and all the bells and whistles, but the real guts of the thing is a piece of junk. I think that's what actually took place. So this is my assessment. I think evangelicalism, as you come to what it has defined itself by the 1980s, as it grew through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, its profile and perceived significance is not consistent with its actual condition. It is fractured, it is fragile and frail in comparison to the Protestantism that existed in the 16th and 17th century. And so while there were new churches, there were new spokesmen, there were new institutions, there were new theologians, the amalgamum of neo-evangelicalism was, in my opinion, negative, not positive. I think we should look to another man and another place to be able to see what is a better example during the same point in history and under the same kinds of difficulties. And so Martin Lloyd-Jones in London at Westminster Chapel, I think, is the example that we should look to. I'm going to show you a few books. If you want to, and you can borrow these if you sign in blood. This is just a summary of Lloyd-Jones's sort of theology and life. This is by Jason Meyer. He was the pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church. This is Lloyd-Jones. This is what we're talking about, little short book that he produced, What is an Evangelical? And this is a little booklet, The Basis of Christian Unity by Lloyd-Jones. This is, we're probably not going to have time, but he gave a message that really created a stir in addition to John Stott getting up right after he gave the message and tried to basically say, don't do what you think Lloyd-Jones told you to do. So this is a part of Lloyd-Jones's message that he gave. So when we think about this tension, we have to think about, so mainline denominations have been consumed by the cancer of modernism. Ecumenicalism is like this dominant force that churches are wanting to sort of be united at the cost of doctrinal distinctives and gospel truth. And we can look to especially Ian Murray's book, Evangelicalism Divided, and how he gives us a picture of Martin Lloyd-Jones's life, his ministry, his philosophy. And I think this is a better example for us to learn from to navigate our own day and age. Now, I'll just confess, my own life has been significantly influenced by Evangelicalism Divided, that book by Ian Murray, as well as Martin Lloyd-Jones. And so maybe I've got a little too much to defend personally. Malia and I moved to California. We left a Southern Baptist church because of going to Shepherd Conference, I think in the year 2000, and maybe it was 2001. I think it was 2000. Ian Murray gave a message. They gave us this book. I read this book and was convinced of the argument and moved to California to be a part of Grace Church and go to the Master's Seminary. But what Murray does in the book Evangelicalism Divided is he takes a look at Martin Lloyd-Jones in contrast to Billy Graham through the same period of time, and he outlines the philosophy and commitments, especially as it relates to the gospel and gospel unity or partnership. My short version of what Ian Murray is saying is that Billy Graham was well received by society at large. He was while being visibly associated with apostate church leaders and even churches, while trying to remain committed to a reduced core of the gospel in a truncated way and with a truncated ministry setting. Martin Lloyd-Jones, on the other hand, was ultimately ushered out of influence of society at large and the church at large in Britain because of his commitment to the gospel in its full biblical and theological form, while opposing the appearance of associating with apostate church leaders and apostate denominations. So in that sense, they took totally different approaches, and pragmatically, one would say Billy Graham was successful and Lloyd-Jones was not. I think that that's the wrong conclusion because it's too short-sighted. Lloyd-Jones, I think, is the exam that we should follow, and I think Billy Graham is the one that we should not. Lloyd-Jones, in one sense, is a Luther-like figure to me. However, there are differences that I have with him, as all of your heroes, you will find out. Two challenges for me that are disappointments. Lloyd-Jones held to a Keswick view of sanctification. I just found that out in the last 5 years. I was emotionally saddened the day that I read that. But all right, that's a great question. What is Keswick theology? If you have a view of higher life, sanctification, or Tim, you got any other synonyms? Let go and let God. Yeah, so it basically is saying that you don't have to intellectually and volitionally be engaged to grow in the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. Rather, by a spiritual experience, you are able to progress in sanctification apart from, independent from, you perceiving the truth of God that relates to your life as a Christian and then choosing to practice and live in light of that. And so it's that's why the let go and let God is one way to summarize that. Methodists do that. A lot of Baptists do that. A lot of Christians from but there are doctrinal distinctions. Wesleyans hold to this view of sanctification. Pentecostal holiness holds to this view of sanctification. Campus Crusade for Christ, the little blue book called the Are You Filled with the Holy Spirit or something like that? That's a Keswick view of sanctification. Bible churches that sometimes emerge from Dallas Theological Seminary, they can hold to this view of that. Not all of them, but some of them. So that's under this bracket of Keswick views of sanctification. But I'm gonna have to stop there.
What's your other discipline?
There is some debate about Martin Lloyd-Jones being some form of a charismatic. So Ian Murray, who was an assistant to Lloyd-Jones, says no, he was not. That's a misreading and a misunderstanding. And John Piper disagrees with Ian Murray. So the Lord Jesus clearly has dealt with whatever needs to be dealt with. But so in that way, my point is to say is that you have heroes, but your heroes, at some sense, may disappoint you. They may differ from you, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be heroes. But what I'd like to do is actually pause there, open it up for questions, because I really want to give more time for us to really look a little bit at the example of Lloyd-Jones in this particular point in history, so that we can see, like, how should we navigate these relationships with a steadfastness to the gospel in its full orbed biblical truth and in a fully formed biblical ministry. So Martin Lloyd-Jones was a pastor at Westminster Chapel. Martin Lloyd-Jones was an expository preacher. Martin Lloyd-Jones was a theologian. And so evangelists by nature have a truncated ministry. Pastors in one place laboring for a long period of time with the same people can have more of that. You have to develop the full-orbed ministry. And I think Lloyd-Jones definitely has a very fully formed understanding of the gospel and the word of God. It is the example that we should follow, in contrast to Billy Graham. I didn't think he did. Kevin.
Question from Zoom land. What is dispensationalism exactly?
Oh, good question. So I did associate dispensationalism with fundamentalism, and dispensationalism is, I guess, still under debate by those who are dispensationalists. Generally, it is understood as presently there's three different versions of it. It is said to have originated with I think he's an Englishman. At least he was from Britain. Darby, right, Tim? Darby is his last name. And the manner in which, I'll just try to make it as short as I can, the manner in which that it seeks to understand the relationships between the biblical covenants and therefore Israel and the church is with a great deal of distinctions. Some forms of dispensationalism make it as if, at least it seems to me, that the way of salvation in some dispensations is different than the way of salvation through Christ and the gospel. So that would be the big concern that some people have about dispensationalism. That's an adequate concern. There are other versions of dispensationalism, and one is called, so you have classic dispensationalism that has 7 distinct dispensations of how God relates to his people. It's kind of an economy of redemption, and he relates to them according to that economy, that setup, that relationship. And in that classic form, there are significant differences from some of those dispensations to others. There is another version called Revised Dispensationalism, which I think is attributed to Charles Ryrie primarily, and that is where it is. It doesn't have as many distinctions in the way God relates to his redeemed people in the dispensations. However, it does retain very clear points of discontinuity between the church and Israel, such the way in which God relates to Israel is significantly different than the way in which God relates to the church. The third version of dispensationalism is progressive dispensationalism, which has far more continuity in the way that God relates to Israel and the church, yet still holds to differences in the way God relates to the church and the way he relates to Israel. What is common in each one of these versions, classic, revised, and progressive, is that the church does not replace Israel, and that God's promises to the nation, the ethnic people of Israel, including the land promises, the Davidic promises, that those are going to be fulfilled after the church is raptured. So those are the features that clearly distinguish dispensationalism from other views. There's historic premillennialism, which does hold to a literal millennial reign of Jesus as the Davidic king from Jerusalem on earth, but it doesn't have the same kind of distinctions between that the church is going to be removed, then the fulfillment of the promises to ethnic national Israel. So that would be my offhanded explanation of what dispensationalism is. I know Tim is quite familiar with dispensationalism. Would you add, like, is there any essential point of dispensationalism that I have missed? So Tim is saying it became very popular in America because of the publication of the Scofield Study Bible. Scofield was a lawyer, and he wrote study notes and that was published as the Scofield Study Bible. Tim was also saying, and I think I tried to clarify this, is that dispensationalism holds a distinction between the church in Israel. Promises made to Israel are going to be fulfilled to Israel after the church is raptured. So that's where the distinction between church and Israel is within all versions of dispensationalism. But then there's also the eschatological positions, such as the rapture of the church, and then the place of Israel in the millennial kingdom as a national, ethnic nation in the land. Is that what you were saying, Tim? Yeah. So, to be honest, I went to Master's Seminary, and I'm so thankful I did. And it teaches dispensationalism. I think I'm still wondering at times if I am a dispensationalist, but I hold to distinctions between the church and Israel. I hold to a future for the redemption of ethnic Israel that has ethnic believing Jewish people in the land, so that there are future fulfillment promises. But I do see some continuity between the way God relates to Israel and the way God relates to the church. So I guess it's maybe up for debate. I still think that the millennium comes after Jesus returns. So that is, Jesus returns before the millennial kingdom, and I think he reigns on earth. So I'm pre-millennial. And I presently still hold to that the departure of the church is going to be before Jesus comes and sets up that millennial reign. So, That's what our church's elders' doctrinal positions are. So I think I am a dispensationalist, but sometimes I do wonder.
John Nelson Darby, Westminster London.
That's right, John Nelson Darby. That's a great question. Who asked it? Oh, okay, great question, April. Yeah, that was, maybe you didn't know that you were getting that. It's a big question. Yes. Which Darby wasn't American. So so it's not an American creation. So Chiliism is what it was called. That was the Latin word for millennium. So premillennialism has existed throughout church history. So that's 2,000 years, and that's obviously not an American invention. But the distinctions of Darby and Schofield's dispensationalism are unique to them. So that is definitely theirs. And fundamentalism held to all those views. Fundamentalism is dispensational, which Machen despised and even refused to be president of Bryan College because it was dispensational. So we're going to talk through some of those things. Is a question? Who? Nico, I'm sorry.
I mean, when you were talking about the SPC, kind of like the quality of the churches and stuff, I was thinking about G3 Network and how they would relate to one another and the structure and like maybe the way that they would handle their money and stuff. I didn't know, about how that works.
Have no idea. But I can just tell you, if it's going to be consistent with a Baptist ecclesiology, there's no authority outside the local church. So everything is elective, voluntary. So you're going to have to use some kind of word. The thing about modern evangelical Protestants is they're afraid of words. They're especially afraid of old words, which in my opinion were more clear words. And they're afraid of them because of the connotations. So they're afraid of the word confederation. They probably are afraid of the word union. But those are words that communicate the nature of the way in which they can relate. It is elective, it is volunteer, and it has no authority outside the church. So whatever they do, they're going to do something that is consistent with that. And they can't do anything other than that unless they breach their own ecclesiology. So you're just sort of, and we'll get into Lloyd-Jones. I think you're going to choose between things that still fundamentally have to be consistent with your view of the nature of the church. So we'll double back to Martin Lloyd-Jones next week, which will touch on these things. Thank you. You have suffered long. I appreciate it. You are dismissed. It's really good. There's a lot of questions. I mean, I think this is rich land for the taking. So if you haven't read, I can recommend a number of things for you to read. Some I have, some I don't have. So, okay. Thanks.